Hey guys, check it out. We're going to be building the MiniMill today. This is one of the latest OpenBuilds creations. The little mill that allows you to just mill up prototype parts really quick. You can do some really interesting things with this machine. It's very strong, very precise, and is quickly becoming our go-to machine. So let's go over a few key points of the MiniMill. So the MiniMill is a true 3-axis machine. It could be converted into a little 3D printer if you wanted to. You could add a laser onto the side here. And the cool thing about this is the X-axis can come all the way forward here and allow you to remove your parts without any interference of the bit or anything like that. You can see you can cut all kinds of precision plates. Just a lot of really cool project that this machine can do. And it's just a really nice desktop size unit. We have handles here so you can just pick it up. It's pretty much portable. I've mounted the power supply to the back. You can also mount your electronics back there. It's completely moddable. There's ideas for vacuum hold down. You can do reduction systems across the top here. We can create a bellows systems here. So let's just take a quick look at the overview of the MiniMill. You can see here you have an up and down Z axis, and this uses a C-beam double wide gantry plate which utilizes mini V wheels. They ride inside the track. So this whole thing, including the motor, everything that you see here locked in would be the Z-axis actuator. And of course it has a router mount and spindle mounted to it. If you look across here, you'll notice this is similar. This is our X-axis. And it also has the motor, flexible coupling, the lead screw. However, it uses the C-beam XL plate, which as you notice here, rides on the outside of the C-beam. Also has the jog knob. So this in itself is an actuator as well. Across the bottom here, you'll see we have the Y-axis actuator. You can see this is the longest of the actuators. So the Z-axis is the shortest. The X is the middle, and then the Y is the longest. And again, it's very similar, has your motor, lead screw driven, the works. So these three actuators combined create this machine. We also have what I like to call frame components, which are basically exactly that, the frame. They make up the structure of the unit, which are these back areas here. And by bolting these together in this configuration, you can attach your actuators to it and create a really cool machine using modular V-slot components. To get started, we're going to build the X-axis. It is the middle size axis, and it's the one that you see across here. Okay, so to get started, you're going to want to grab your 3 lead screws. These are the 3 lead screws for the 3 X, Y, and Z actuators. Let's just take a look. I'm going to line them up small to large, and this way you'll know what you're working with. So the smallest one here is going to be your Z axis. That's your up and down. The left to right is your X, and then the longest one is going to be the Y. So out of all 3 of them, we want the middle size one here. We're going to go ahead and put it to the side, put the other ones away, and let's move on to the next step. Alright, so let's get started. Locate 4 of the extreme solid V-wheel kits. Go ahead and pour out the contents. Show you how to build one of these. So you have your wheel shell, you have 2 bearings, 2 of the precision shims, and 1 M5 lock nut. So basically just push a bearing in the wheel shell, flip it over, put one of the precision shims in there. It's a spacer between the bearings. And then take the other bearing and press fit it in like you see here. Don't worry if the washer's offset a little bit. When you go to put it on the screw, it'll go on there. And that's all you need to do right now. So let's go ahead and build all 4 of these. Okay, so we have all 4 of the wheel kits built. Now we'll go ahead and grab the C-beam XL gantry plate. You'll need this next. This is what it looks like. As well as 4 of our 25mm low profile screws. We also need our 2 6mm aluminum spacers and 2 6mm eccentric spacers. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, for this step we're going to be attaching the wheels to the XL gantry plate. So you need your 8mm wrench and Allen key. And I just want to show you a couple things on this plate. You'll notice there's a larger set of holes here on the back. And these holes are designed for the eccentrics to fit into the lip here. If you notice, the eccentric has a lip on it. And they slide right in like this. This gives you that cam function of moving the wheel back and forth to tighten or loosen it on the rail system. And then opposite side of the plate, you'll see we have our standard holes here with the recesses. And these will just be for our standard aluminum spacers on the bottom. So we'll go ahead and start building. In fact, I think we'll start with these standard holes here at the bottom. We're only concerned with these outside set of holes here and as well on the eccentric. So we're putting 4 wheels on this plate. Go ahead and get your low profile screw, slide it in. Just like you see here, just follow along. Finger on there. Get your aluminum spacer, slide it on, get one of your precision shims that you have left over from the wheel kit. One side is kind of sharp and the other side has like a rounded edge. Make sure you put the rounded edge facing up away from the plate. Our next move is to bring our wheel in. I also like to take the OpenBuilds logo and face it out. And then last but not least, our M5 lock nut. Let's go ahead and hand tighten that for now. And that's good. And set the plate like this. Get our wrench, our Allen, and let's go ahead and tighten that down just a little. Don't have to overdo it, just snug it in place. Make sure that you have free movement and you have a nice tight fit, and that's really nice. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do this hole. Opposite side here. Same routine. Screw, spacer, again feel for the rounded side, face it out. Go ahead, look for the logo, face it out, M5 lock nut, and let's go ahead and tighten this one in position. That's really nice. So we have 2 of them on, 2 of the wheels are on there, and they're nice and tight, but they roll nice and smooth. So we're going to focus our attention on the 2 wheels that will use the eccentrics here. Before we get started on that, I want you to take your eccentric and take note of how it's an offset cam. And if you notice on that inside hole, the farthest point here, if you look at the face, I've already done it here, just take a black marker, like a Sharpie marker, and just color that face in. It will make life so much easier when you go to adjust these. Even though it says 6 millimeters there, it can be hard to see once the wheel's on top. So go ahead and color those in. I've already done it for both of these eccentrics, like that. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm flipping the plate over opposite the side of the recess. I'm going to go ahead and put my eccentric in the hole. So take notice that I'm going to face the black mark that we made out this way towards the edge of the plate. And that'll be moving the wheels as far this way, as far apart as possible. So I'm going to take my screw and I'm going to put it up through the bottom here, right through the eccentric. So this is what it should look like right now. Okay, so our next thing is, don't forget your precision shim. Again, the rounded side facing out, slide that on. Logo facing out for the wheel. M5 lock nut on top. Just hand tighten that. Now these, we want to go ahead and just snug these in position. And the reason why is we need to be able to adjust this cam later, this eccentric. So go ahead and just kind of snug it to the plate like that, knowing that later you have to come back and adjust that cam. Once you get that in position where you want it, we'll go ahead and tighten it down all the way. So let's go ahead and do the other side. We're going to put the eccentric on the bottom, face the black part out, away, and put the screw through. Put the precision shim on, and logo facing out for the wheel. Put our M5 nut on. Go ahead and tighten that down just a little. And that completes building the XL gantry plate with the wheel sets on it. This looks really good. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Alright, so on this step we're going to go ahead and tighten our eccentrics to a piece of C-beam. Let's go ahead and bring in a piece of C-beam, 250 millimeters. This is going to be for the X-axis. So what we're going to want to do first is just slide the plate on here. You can see you're lining up the wheels with the groove on the C-beam. And you'll notice that the plate is loose. It's because we need to tighten our eccentrics. So go ahead and stand the plate up like this, so you can have access to where the eccentrics are. And we'll go ahead and take our wrench and slowly turn these. They should hit out, this one hit out right here, already touching. So it takes a little bit of a feel, but as soon as you feel it touch the rail, then you go ahead and go to the next one and turn them in the same direction. So we're turning these to the right, so it helps with tightening them. So I have a little bit of friction on both of these wheels. Just going to go back and forth a couple more times, trying to even out what the friction feels like. And that's perfect. It's really simple. And once you do it once, you have the feel for it. So now lay it down. If you can wiggle this up and down like this side I'm tight on, but this side I can't. So I know I need to move that a little bit more. So go ahead and turn that a little bit more. Make sure it really locks. And now I can roll freely, but I can't wiggle it this way at all. So we're good. Now remember, we never tighten these all the way down. We just snugged them. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to take my wrench, hold it underneath, tighten this down a little bit. You don't have to overdo it. These things lock on and they'll stay there. And the great thing about it is it's completely adjustable. Double check, because sometimes when you tighten it, it moves it, and this one just did. I could feel it moving this side up and down a little bit. So we go ahead and stand this up, turn this to the right. We're nice and tight now. I think I could go a little bit more. There we go. And that completes setting that up. That's beautiful. That rolls really smooth, and it is nice and tight and not going anywhere. And the eccentrics are only at the halfway mark. Plenty of adjustment room. Now, one thing I want to mention while we're here, we're using these polycarbonate wheels. The only lubricant you want to use on these is silicone. So what I end up using is just this silicone spray, paper towel, spray it on there, and just give it a little bit of rub on the track here. Let me take this plate off. And I usually just rub it right on that track, and that does a really good job. Once you put that silicone on there, this thing rolls so smooth. It's amazing. So that looks good. Again, only use the silicone for lubricant and it will do you proud. All right, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so on this step, we already started building our X actuator, and I just wanted to show you. You'll notice that we have black angle corner connectors here. These connect into the rail using T-nuts. This is what they look like. These little guys slide right into the rail, and they give you something to screw the corner connector into. What you can't see, or maybe you can, I'm not sure, I'm going to try to tilt it, is this plate is also screwed on, two screws on this side that go into T-nuts in the track here, and also on the opposite side here and here. The reason why I'm mentioning this is before we go ahead and put these C-beam end mounts on, we want to make sure we have those T-nuts in place. So obviously we'll need 2 on this side and 2 on this side, and on the bottoms 2 as well, 4 as well, 2 on each side. So just to give you a little bit of a visual for what we're doing on our next step. Okay, in this step, you're going to want to locate 4 of your black angle corner connectors, 4 8mm screws, and 4 of the T-nuts. And we're going to go ahead and remove the gantry plate. Let's just set that to the side. Bring up our tracks, and we're going to slide the T-nuts in. And you'll notice how it goes in like this, just fits in the track, it slides down, and 2 on each side, just like that. Flip this around, 2 on this side, there we go. That looks good. I'll just leave that like that for right now. Take a black angle corner connector, just set it over top of the hole. Actually, it might be easier just to slide the screw right in there like that, and then try to line it up, set it on there. For this step, I like to use the ball nut drivers, so much easier. So just line that up. You don't have to tighten it down right now, just kind of get it somewhere lined up. Let's go ahead and put this one on. See, if you get it started like this, so much easier. Like that, they're in there. So this side, we're gonna have to kind of do laying down because the other ones are holding it up. This one. At this point, we're just guessing where they go. Later, of course, they'll line up with the plate that'll be underneath this. But for now, I would just suggest loosening these up, making them flush with the table here. Just something like that. So I loosened them up, snugged them back when I knew that they were flush here. You can see they're completely off-centered and everything. Don't worry about that. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next step. All right, so for this step, let's go ahead and get 4 more of our T-nuts. We're going to flip this over, and we're just going to slide these again like this in these outside tracks here. So like this, one on this side. So just something like that. Doesn't matter where they're at right now. And on this side as well. And what's going to happen is later on, when we attach this X-axis to the Y plate, this will give us some mounting threads to do that. All right, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, let's go ahead and move our X-axis to the side for now and bring our plate, our C-beam XL plate, back in. We have one more thing that we need to do to this plate, which is to attach an anti-backlash nut block to it, which will sit on this side. So we'll go ahead and get that set up, and we'll move on to that step next. All right, at this point, let's go ahead and bring in our anti-backlash nut block. You can see it looks like this, piece of plastic. The lead screw actually goes through here. This allows you to adjust this little lip here and give it any kind of a preload that you need. You also should have 2 M5 lock nuts, 1 grub screw, and 1 low profile M5 nut. Go ahead and look at the grub screw, and you'll notice it has the Allen hole on this side here. We'll just go ahead and screw the opposite side down in there, side that does not have the Allen hole. So you want to be able to access it here with the tool. Go ahead and screw that down in there. As it starts to come through, you want to get it to where it just kisses that lip on the other side there. So, and that's what you want. And then go ahead and take that low profile nut, screw that on top of it like this, and that'll lock it in place. And this just gives you, again, adjustment. So on the lead screw, it adds a little bit of preload, so there's not any slop as you move the plate back to front on the screw. Okay, that looks good. Let's take our M5 nuts, slide them into these hex-shaped slots on the back here. Might have to push it against the table to get it to seat, but that's what it should look like. This is pre-built, ready to go. Let's locate 2 20mm screws, low profile screws, as well as 2 3mm aluminum spacers. That's these guys right here. So the plan is, if you look at the plate, you'll notice you have these oblong holes here. So the lead screw runs in this direction, not this direction. So knowing that, we're going to need to mount this anti-backlash nut block in this direction so the lead screw can run through it, but underneath obviously. So take your 20mm screw and drop it in this hole and this hole, just like you see here. Okay, and then take your fingers, hold it on there, flip the whole thing over. Again, we have the oblong holes here and here. You can take your 3mm spacers, aluminum spacers, and put them on the screws. So it looks like this at this point. Take your anti-backlash nut block, line it up like you see here. It's going to go through the anti-backlash nut block, and then we're going to screw them into these hex. So just go ahead and set it on there for now, and let's just spin it over so we can get to it. Take one of your ball drivers or your Allen key and just tighten that down and just snug it in place. And then I'm going to back it off just a hair so that I can move it. It's a little bit of movement here, right? And then what that'll do is when I put my lead screw through here, it'll help me to seat everything once we have the whole unit together. It'll kind of self-align. So that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. So on this step, while we have this exposed like this with the anti-backlash nut block, let's bring in our lead and we'll go ahead and just thread it through. If it doesn't thread easily through this end, try it from this side. And just thread it through here and feel if it needs any type of adjustment on this. Now you can always go back in and adjust this tensioner later. You don't want it too tight, but you shouldn't have any movement there either, like any play. So just thread it through and make sure it goes through easily, and that looks really good. Again, we're leaving this loose, pretty loose. I'm going to tighten that just a little bit more. There, I can still move it, but that's good right there. All right, let's move on to the next step. On this step, let's go ahead and bring our X-axis C-beam back in. Let's take our plate, go ahead and slide it on here. Remember, eccentrics are on one side. The standard spacers are on this side, so you know how the plate goes. It goes on like that. make sure there's no movement. Looks good. And looking down here, you can see where the lead screw is going to run through the anti-backlash nut block. That looks good. Be careful because we have these T-nuts on the bottom. Be careful when you tilt it. All right, so it's on there. It looks good. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, let's bring our lead screw back in, and let's just put it under here and screw it through the anti-backlash nut block, and we'll get it to a halfway point. So something like this is what you're after. For this step, locate 2 of your 8mm lock collars and their grub screws, and we'll go ahead and put the grub screws into the lock collars. Obviously, don't go all the way in because we need to be able to get in there with the lead screw. All right, that looks good. Go ahead and slide these on each end of the lead. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, you're going to want to locate 2 of your 8mm shims. They look like real thin, and they have a rounded side as well as a sharp side. Let's go ahead and face the rounded side outward and slide these on to the lead screw. So again, this rounded side on this side will face that way. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, you're going to want to locate 2 of your 8mm inside diameter bearings. This is what they look like. And just slide them onto each end of the lead screws. So we're building up the lead screw so that we can put the end mounts on. So let's move on to that step now. All right, on this step, you want to locate 2 of the C-beam end mounts. This is what they look like. You'll notice that they have a recessed side here. That will be for the bearings on the ends here and here. You'll also notice that there's recessed sides here for these 4 holes for the screws. That will be facing to the outside when we screw these into the outside of the plate. So one will go here, the other one will go here. You're also going to want to locate 8 of your 15mm screws because these are the screws we're going to use to mount these end mounts. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to move this over. Again, I'm facing the recess here to the inside because it's going to receive the bearing. We'll just slide it over. And you'll notice these 4 holes here line up to the tapped holes in the C-beam. So we'll go ahead and insert our screws and just tighten that down. Let's go ahead and do that for all 4. I bring this plate all the way in, like you see here. Make sure I'm flush on the bottom and everything, and then I just crack these loose just a hair, like that. Okay, that looks good. We'll spin it around and also screw this plate in place. Again, the recess faces the bearing, and the 4 recesses face the outside screw holes. Pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and connect this. So again, I have these tightened down. I'm just going to crack them a little bit. And all I'm doing is just backing these off just a hair. They're still full on connected, they're just a little bit loose. All right, so at this point, we're gonna slide these bearings into the recesses that you see here. Move it around, line it up, slide the lock collar over. Same thing on this side, like that. All right, that looks good. We're not tightening these down yet, the grub screws of the lock collars just yet. We need to gauge how far this is gonna stand out. For this step, locate your 1/4x8 flexible coupling. You'll notice it has clamping style screws here for squeeze pressure. It also has set screws here. If these set screws are tightened up, it won't allow it to go on, so make sure you back these out a little bit. You're going to take your 8mm side and slide it onto the end here. There is a stopping point, so it can only go so far. So go ahead and push your lead screw out if you need to, just to make sure that this reaches the stopping point. Once it does, go ahead and tighten this down. I like to do the clamp first. On this clamp, you really need to tighten it all the way until this is completely closed. This gap is completely closed. So once this gap is completely closed, as you can see here, it will grab the lead screw on the last couple turns, and that's good. So now let's flip it over and we'll tighten down this set screw so it doesn't move. And there we go. That's a good lock. So now I know we had the bearings recessed in here. It's no big deal. We can move this back and forth. What we're trying to accomplish here is barely having any space between here, but enough so it's not rubbing on the end of the plate here. So just back it off a little bit. Go ahead and put your bearing back in. Just leave yourself a millimeter or two there. Just leave yourself a little bit of room there and go ahead and tighten this grub screw down like that. Now that's locked in place. We'll go ahead and push this one over. Make sure it's recessed. Everything looks good there. So the idea is you don't want any play in this system, as you can see here. So the way to get rid of that is you make sure that this lock collar is pressed against this bearing and this lock collar is pressed against this bearing. Then you don't get any movement at all. So go ahead and do that now. Push it this way and make sure you push the lock collar that way and tighten it in place. That looks good. There's no play side to side here. So let's go back and remember we cracked these a little bit. Let's go ahead and tighten those down now. Half a turn till they're in place. That'll add even a little more tension. It's starting to become really solid. There's no play here. Let's go ahead and bring this all the way to this end here. And then we'll tighten down little turns back and forth to just seat that. You don't want to deform the plastic. To seat the anti-backlash nut block. So that looks good. Alright, so that looks really good. It's nice and tight. Our T-nuts can no longer fall out, which is good. We'll get to those later as we mount the Y actuator to it. But this is a nice, strong gantry system. Again, if you're going to lubricate, use silicone. You can spray in here, you can spray the lead screw, the wheels, only silicone. Very good. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, you're going to want to locate your NEMA 23 stepper motor, also 2 of the 40mm aluminum spacers and 2 55mm low profile screws. So what we're going to do is attach our stepper motor to the X-axis gantry. One thing to keep in mind while you're doing this is to make sure that your wires are facing down. So just insert the stepper motor shaft into the flex coupling, put your spacers in between, and slide your screws through the spacer, through the back of the motor and the spacer, and you'll notice it'll go into a threaded insert onto the C-beam end plate. Go ahead and thread that in place. Let's go ahead and do the other side as well. Again, just put the spacer in between, slide the screw in the back. So at this point, they're not tightened all the way down. I can still kind of move the spacer. So I'm going to flip this over and go ahead and just tighten this down a little bit more, making sure that we get this motor snug. Just like that. That looks good. Nice and tight. For this step, we're going to tighten down the set screws of the flex coupling to the stepper motor shaft. You can turn the unit here to kind of get where you need to set. One of the things you need to do first is to, on this particular setup, is to tighten down this particular set screw onto the flat side of the stepper motor shaft. So locate the flat side of the stepper motor shaft and you can see it's here. And I'm just going to align this set screw with that. Once you have that aligned, go ahead and just tighten that set screw onto the flat side of that shaft. That assures that there's no movement. When that stepper motor shaft turns, that set screw locks it on that flat part of the shaft and it's not going anywhere. So it's a very important step to make sure that that's on there. I wiggle it back and forth a little bit just to make sure it's in. And we can flip this over and now we'll tighten down the clamping set screw. Just a few turns for this one and it locks it to the shaft. And that is a nice looking actuator unit. One more step here is to add the jog knob to the end. We'll go ahead and spin this around like this so we can work with it. And we'll do that on the next step. Alright, for this step we're going to be adding the OpenBuilds jog knob to the 8mm lead on this end of the X-axis. So you need your jog knob. We also need 2 of the grub screws that come with the jog knob, as well as an 8mm shim. So one of the things to mention at this point is that the bore of the jog knob is slightly larger than the diameter of the lead, so it can have an offset effect. Doesn't affect anything to do with the machine's precision, just doesn't look optimal. Some guys have gone and added Teflon tape to the outside here and they can center it. You can also adjust it pretty well just by adjusting these 2 grub screws. Either way, it works fine and it gives you the ability to jog the machine really easily. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll add our 8mm shim and you'll notice it has a round side, and this round side I'm going to face inward. towards the plate. And we'll go ahead and put our grub screws into the jog knob. Let's get them started. You can kind of see them pop through there, and you back them off because you need to be able to slide it on. This one started. Okay, so I got them in there, just backed off a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and slide this on. And we'll go ahead, I like to go back and forth between the two and kind of get it centered the best you can. If it's too tight, like this one right here is too tight, I need to back it away from a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So I backed it off a little bit. You can see there's a little bit of a gap there. And that gives me a really nice jog handle. You can see it's off center a little, but it doesn't hurt anything. That looks awesome. So that is our X-axis actuator complete. We'll move on to the next step. So at this point, we've just finished our X-axis actuator. Looks really nice. That is, of course, this actuator here for the left and right movements. We're going to be building next our Y actuator, which is the one that runs front to back. If you notice, it is identical to the X, with the exception that it has these little mounting feet. So if you want to mount your C-beam MiniMill to the table, you can. There are also a couple spots here where the frame attaches to this Y actuator, so we're going to need to add some T-nuts in the track here, and obviously on the other side and where these feet are. But other than that, it's basically the same exact build. So let's go ahead and move forward with the build. Alright guys, so we're going to start the Y-axis. Again, it's just like the X-axis build. We start with the plates and adding the wheels to the plate. So let's go ahead and do that now. I've already built the 4 wheel kits. Remember, it's 2 bearings with one of these precision shims in between them as a separator. I have 4 25mm screws, and also want to bring in 2 of my 6mm aluminum spacers and 2 of my 6mm eccentric spacers. And you'll notice that we put a black mark on the shortest side of where the cam is, just to make it a little bit easier. So once you get all these parts together, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, you have on the plate, you have the larger holes here. These are the holes for the cams. They fit in there, and this gives you the ability to adjust the wheels towards and away from the rail. Opposite of those holes are the holes across the bottom here, and these are just your standard wheels with the 6mm spacer as an offset. Alright, so we'll get started. We'll grab one of our screws. We're going to start with our standard spacers. Again, we're putting the rounded side of the washer out towards the wheel. I have the logo facing out. M5. Just hand tighten for now. Okay, that looks really good. Move on to the next one. Alright, that completes the standard spacer side. We'll work on the eccentrics next. So putting the lip of the eccentric in and facing the black mark out away towards this edge of the plate. Put our screw through. Precision shim. Our wheel. M5 lock nut. And tighten that down, but remember, don't over tighten it because you still have to move it. You can snug it pretty good though. Do the other one now. Okay, that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, we're going to go ahead and install the anti-backlash nut block. So you're going to want to go ahead and get that kit together, as well as 2 20mm screws and 2 3mm spacers. So we'll go ahead and get that set up now. Alright, so like last time, we're going to get the anti-backlash nut block ready. So we're going to take our set screw, grub screw, put it in. Make sure that the part that you can put the hex driver in is exposed, so you can tighten that down. Just go ahead and tighten it until it just kisses the lip there. Get your low profile M5, put that on. And that's good. A lot of times you may not even need to tighten this down. It already has a little bit of spring tension just from the tapping process. So that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. go ahead and bring in the longest lead screw that you have, and we're just going to go ahead and thread this through and make sure that it goes back and forth through on the lead easily, which it does. If it's too loose, just go ahead and tighten this down a little bit, and that'll give it a little bit of tension, and that's really nice. There's no play there. All right, that looks good. Let's set the lead to the side and move on to the next step. On this step, we're going to be attaching our anti-backlash nut block to the XL plate. And you may remember from doing the X-axis, the lead is going to run this way along with where these oblong holes are. So let's go ahead and put the screws in. It's like you see here. I'm going to put my fingers on here to hold them. Go ahead and put the 3mm aluminum spacers on. Let me set this down for just 1 second. Put these M5 lock nuts into the receiving holes you see here, and just kind of loosely put that on top. I'm going to flip this over and we'll tighten these down. Remember from last time, we tighten these down and then we back them off a little bit, and you don't want to deform the plastic. So I've tightened these down and now I'm just going to back it off a little. That's a little too loose. Tighten it down a little bit more so it's snug. The idea is that later it'll be able to seat itself, find its own position as you run it back and forth on the gantry. And once you get it in position, then you can lock it in place like we did last time. All right, cool. That looks great. Let's move on to the next step. All right, for this step, we're going to adjust our eccentrics to the Y C-beam. So go ahead and bring in the C-beam. It's the largest one out of all the C-beams that we have. And we'll go ahead and just slide this on like we did for the X. Spin this around like this and stand it up so we can access our eccentrics. And I'm going to turn these to the right until, remember, this is what you should feel. It's very loose pulling this up and down. So go ahead and turn these in until we feel a little bit of friction. Just want a little friction on there, so you know you're seated in the rail. And you can always test it by putting it down like this, and you can see this side's moving. And I'm only moving this like a millimeter or two at a time. There you go. Nice and tight, but yet it moves. And then remember, we still need to tighten these up. So we'll go through and do that now. Alright, so that looks really good. We have no movement other than our linear movement, and that's what we're after. It looks great. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, let's go ahead and bring in our lead screw, and it's the longest out of all of them. Go ahead and just screw this through the nut block on the bottom. So something like this where you have about a little bit of even amount on each side. Try to center it. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, we're going to be adding the lock collars, bearings, and shims to each end of our lead screw here. So you want to go ahead and get your 8mm lock collars, 8mm shims, and 8mm bearings. Go ahead and put the set screws into your lock collars. All right, that looks good. We're going to put our lock collars on first. Just slide them on each end. It should look like that. Go ahead and take our 8mm shim. And if you feel it again, the rounded side I'm going to have facing out, away from the lock collar. Same on this one. And then our bearings. And of course you can, maneuver these as you go and work with it. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to the next step. So before we move ahead, we need to make sure that we put the T-nuts in the track to accept both the feet as well as the frame connections. So we're going to go ahead and do that now before we close up the ends. And for the feet, we're just going to flip this over like you see here, and you can see how I'm putting these in. Just slide them into the end here like we've done before. And these will be for the mounting feet on the bottom here. Then you're going to take 3 T-nuts, 2, 3 on this top section here, and just go ahead and install them just like you see here. I'm going to spin this around, try not to drop the T-nuts out. I'm going to put 2 on the bottom, Spread these out a little bit, but it doesn't matter, they're gonna slide around. We just need to make sure they're in here. We'll put the 3 for the top mounting plate on the frame. All right, that looks good. Spin this around. So we have our T-nuts in. We want to make sure that we add 2 more T-nuts into the top portion of the frame here. So that makes 12 total. All right, T-nuts are in place. We can move on to the next step. For this step, locate 2 of your C-beam end mount mounting plates. Again, you have the recessed side here for the bearings and the 4 recessed holes here for your screws. So we're just going to slide these on the ends, and you'll also need 8 of your 15mm screws, and that's what we're going to use to mount these. So let's go ahead and do that now. Remember, we're going to tighten these in, and then we're going to crack the screws back a half turn or so just to give it a little wiggle room. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we have everything mounted. Again, I tighten these down and then back them out a little bit. If I hold this, I can wiggle this just barely, but it takes strength. But this helps us to be able to seat these under a little bit of compression once everything is said and done. So let's move on to the next step. It's time to install our 1/4 by 8mm flex coupling. We're going to go ahead and put it on either end, doesn't matter. One thing that does matter is that you push this lead screw out a little bit so you can actually have this bottom out where it needs to go. We'll go ahead and tighten down the clamp one first. And remember, you need to tighten this 8mm side down all the way until the clamp closes, like this. You can feel it grab on the last couple turns. We'll go ahead and rotate this over and tighten down the little set screw. There you go. And that makes a great connection. Let's go ahead and scoot the bearings, lock collar assembly up to the edge here. And just like last time, we're going to leave ourselves 1 millimeter or so it doesn't rub the plate. And I'm just kind of holding it here while I tighten down the lock collar there. That's good, it's not rubbing. Okay, so let's slide this end down, and I'm pushing on this while I'm doing it. I'm going to spin this around to make it a little bit easier. So I'm pushing this in while I've got my fingers pushing against the lock collar to create tension. There's a little bit of play here, so I'm going to do it over. That's much better. And now at this point, let's go through and tighten these plates flush against the side here. And that's just doing that half turn or so. Okay. So you should be able to turn this very freely. You should see it moving. Bring it up here. Again, if you need to lubricate the rail or the lead screw, use silicone. And bring it all the way up here, and then we're going to tighten these down a little bit. Do not deform the plastic, just snug them. If you feel it getting too tight, you've gone too far with it. Well, that's good. All right, so that looks great. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're going to install our OpenBuilds NEMA 23 stepper motor. We're also going to need to locate 2 40mm spacers, aluminum spacers, and 2 55mm low profile screws. One of the things I want to suggest before we get started is take the flat part of the motor shaft, face it up towards the top of the motor, with the wires on the opposite side here, and also rotate your lead until the little set screws are facing up. The idea, let's go ahead and put this in here. The idea is that later it'll be easy just to tighten down this set screw onto the flat part of the shaft. So let's go ahead and get our spacers, and we'll put them on one at a time just like we did last time. Slide your 55mm screws through. Line them up with the threaded holes in the plate, and let's go ahead and install the stepper motor. Okay, so that's as far as I can really go that way. Let's go ahead and flip this over. Kind of alternate, make sure we have it. Remember, the set screw needs to lock in with the flat part of the shaft. Let's go ahead and do that now. And it's such a small screw that you might want to wiggle it back and forth just to make sure it seats properly. And then we'll tighten down the clamp on this one. And that's not going anywhere. That looks great. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so for this step you're going to want to get your OpenBuilds jog knob. It comes with a couple of these set screws. Let's go ahead and install those now. Okay, that looks good. Alright, let's go ahead and get our 8mm shim, slide it on, slide the jog knob on. Whoops, to loosen one of these. There we go. And just hold it off a little bit and alternate back and forth as you tighten these down, and you'll get a pretty centered jog knob. Alright, that looks good. Now we can jog, which is awesome. It's starting to come together, starting to look like a really nice actuator. It's so long I can't hardly fit it in this shot, but it's looking sharp. That's our Y actuator. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, on this step we're going to attach our feet to the Y axis. So you're going to need 4 cast corners and 4 8mm screws. You remember the T-nuts that we put in here. Just going to separate those a little bit. So the idea is just hook the cast corners into the bottom rail here. And again, I just leave them loose because we need to be able to put them down on the table. I like to push it to the front here and just lock it in place like that. So we're going to do that one. Let's go over and do this one while we're at it. It's much easier to get the screw in the cast corner first and then using the ball driver hook it on. That looks good. Scoot it over and lock it down. And that's 2 of them. Let's go ahead and do the other side. Okay, that looks great. So we have our corners on. If we ever want to, we can screw our machine right to the table. If not, it just makes for a little more stable platform when the machine is built. We also have our 3 T-nuts here, and then of course our 1 T-nut here, and these will come in handy later when we go to attach our frame pieces on. Looks great. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so we have 2 really nice X and Y gantry systems. The plan now is to bring in the X. We're going to bolt it down to this plate here on the Y and give ourselves a nice strong connection both here as well as on the bottom where we've added our T-nuts here. So this is going to be just an assembly process. First things first though, we want to find the center of this system here so we can put marks on each side so we know where the center is across the plate here. So let's go ahead and find the center there. So you can see here on the x-axis I have marked 125 because it's 250 length. I'm trying to find the center, and I've done it on both sides here and also translated that over to the edge here so you can see when I'm mounting my plate I know where the center is. So those are the lines I'll go by initially. If I have to tweak and adjust it, I'll go ahead and do that, but for now that's really nice. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so to start out, I have the y-axis here. I'm going to go ahead and turn this with the stepper motor facing me and bring the plate back a little so we can work on it. So something like this, and if you look at I'll bring the x-axis in. I've moved these T-nuts out to the edges here so I can move them in later with the screwdriver. I'm just going to flip this over just like that. And you can see that the motor's off to the right here, and this motor is facing me. So that's kind of the setup that you want. We're going to rotate this and do 1 corner connector at a time. Just want to show you. The corner connector will line up with this tapped hole and this tapped hole. So let's go ahead and just put our 8mm screw in there and tighten that down. Okay, so at this point you're going to want to locate 4 of your 8mm screws, and we're just going to connect our 90-degree corner connectors right to the threaded holes that you see here on the plate. And I've already jogged the plate over. We're going to go ahead and loosen these 2 connectors. So now we can slide them. And remember that we made that center mark here. So the center mark you want to get lined up with the center of the plate here between these 2 oblong holes. Actually, before I even do that, I'm going to go ahead and get this one started. Now I can just kind of slide this back and forth and get it lined up. So that looks good. I'm going to jog this plate back out of the way so we can reach the other side here. Okay, make sure the mark is lined up here. I'm going to line this up here. Mount this. That's good. Again, we're going to go through and we'll square this up from the bottom and just make sure everything's square. We just want to make sure we're mounted at this point. Let's just go ahead and mount these to the rail here now that we're centered. Just make sure you're flush here. I'm using this one because it's just easier to get in there and torque these down. Now we're going to leave these loose on the bottom. And that will allow us to square the system up when the time comes, and we'll do that from underneath. Let's go ahead and we'll spin the system around and we'll go ahead and mount the other corner connectors. If at any time you're jogging your stepper and you notice that it's not jogging freely, just make sure that your wires are not touching here, because if your coils are connected, it won't jog freely. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and mount this. Then we're going to go back and tighten these to the rail. Just make sure that you're seated flush to the platform here. Tighten these down. Okay, that's nice and tight, and we still have these loose, so we can wiggle that around. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so for this step, let's locate 4 of your 12mm screws, and we're going to be attaching this bottom plate once we flip this unit over to the C-beam. So for this step, we're going to go through, line up this top plate using your jog knob with the bottom plate, and just go through these holes here, crack these loose, and loosen up these corners right here. All 4 of them, I've already gone through and done it. So all 4 of them, and once you do, you'll see it's loose. Like that, and that's all you need. So let's flip this whole unit over. So you can see this whole plate is moving, and the idea here is we're going to take these 4 T-nuts here and screw them into these 2 and these 2. So let's go ahead and just, I'm going to take the screwdriver, take one here and fling it over to this side, just like that. Line these up with the holes here. And take our 12mm screws and go ahead and tighten these down. That looks good. I'm going to back all of them off a little bit, and then you barely have any wiggle room here. So I can already see that I'm pretty well squared up. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these down. Looks good. Let's flip the unit over. Alright, back to where we were. We'll go ahead and tighten these black corner connectors back in place. Alright, that looks good. That plate's mounted really well. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for our next step, let's go ahead and move the XY assembly for this to the side for right now. On this step, we're going to need to locate 8 of the mini V-wheels extremes. I have the packs here, and this is what is inside. You have your extreme wheel. You also have 2 mini bearings, 2 precision shims, mini precision shims, and 1 M5 lock nut. And we're going to assemble these the same way that we assemble the solid V-wheel extreme. So bearing goes in first. Just push it down in there, flip it over. Drop one of the mini precision shims in, and then the other bearing to finish that off. So you're going to have a mini precision shim left over and an M5 lock nut, and that's fine. So let's go through and make up all of these. Okay, so now we have the wheel kits put together. I'm just going to move these off to the side a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and bring in our C-beam double wide gantry plate. This is what it looks like. You'll notice that it has 2 holes here that are larger than the 2 holes here above it that are recessed. These are for the eccentrics, And these are for our standard spacers. So there's 2 on this side, 2 on this side, 2 here, 2 here. We'll start with this side on the standards. Let's get the plate first, and then you're going to want to locate 8 of the 25mm screws for mounting the wheels. You're also going to want to locate 4 of the 6mm aluminum spacers and 4 of the 6mm eccentric spacers. Again, with the eccentrics, just find the smallest side of the cam where it's marked 6mm, and you're going to want to go ahead with a black marker and just mark that to make it easier when you actually build that. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we're going to start with the standard spacers here. You're going to get your 25mm screws, put them in. I just put my finger on the back, slide that on for your 6mm aluminum spacer. You're going to want your precision shim, your wheel, and then the M5 lock nut. So that's how we're going to do the 4 across the top here. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so that looks good. Just make sure that you put your, I just have them hand tightened right now, but just make sure that you look that you went through and put your precision shim on each one of these, because sometimes it's easy to forget them. And then we're going to go through and tighten these down. Alright, so that looks good. Make sure they roll freely. They're on there nice and tight. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, we're going to be adding the eccentric side of the wheels to the plate. So we're going to flip this over. We have our eccentrics here. Put them in, and we're going to face the black mark here facing out this way. Slide the screw through. Put our precision shim on. Wheel. M5 lock nut. And just again hand tightening that. So that's what you're after right there. We'll go through and do the rest of these 3. That looks really good. So we're going to go ahead and tighten up the eccentric side wheels. I'm just going to snug these onto the plate so that there's no movement in them, and I'm going to rotate the eccentric, because sometimes they move because they were loose, around to the right until it's facing, till the black mark is facing up like it should be. Just like that. And we'll go through and tighten down the rest of these 3. And then make sure the black mark is facing up. Alright, that looks good. These are nice and snug. The eccentrics are facing up. And these will ride on the inside of the C-beam. So that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, we're going to be adding the preload to the eccentrics so that our double wide C-beam gantry plate can ride on the inside of the C-beam gantry plate. Right now, the eccentrics are too tight. They're all pushed to the outside, which is their maximum. So we're going to rotate them in. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to rotate all of the eccentrics to face this way. I'll show you. Just like that. Let's go ahead and do that now so they're all even. All the black marks facing to the right here. This will give us like the halfway point, and then we'll work from there to add the preload. Okay, that looks good. Something like that. Let's see how that looks. Okay, it goes on, but it's still really too tight to push through there. I can feel it. It's still going to be too tight. So let's go ahead and back them down even a little further. So I'm going to point them down this way. And you're looking for the spot where they are locked onto the rail but not overly tight. So you can see where I have them set at this point. If it was a clock, it'd be set at about 5 o'clock. So all 4 of these. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's much better. Now we just have to make sure we have no up and down movement. This side's okay. I feel a little here. So I'm gonna just, and I'm telling you, just move it a millimeter at a time and add a little preload. And I'm actually, turning these back up this way to add a little more preload. See what that's like. I could add a little more even. So let's do it. So slowly turning these back. few millimeters at a time. And you want to do it evenly. You want to make sure you add preload on all 8 wheels. And that is nice and tight, actually. So what I'm going to do now is tighten these down, all these with the eccentrics. And even though these are tightened, you can still move these a little bit. You just don't like to do it when they're too tight. So let's go through and just tighten these down now. Kind of seat them in place because we know we're very close to where we want to be, and we'll just fine tune it. Okay, everything rolls smooth. All right. So I need a little bit here just to bring that out. So I'm just sliding this on, making sure that the first set of wheels as they go into the track here have some preload. If they don't, that's no good. So that's good. Then the second set of wheels also has some preload. So as we get to the back here, let's do it on this side. First set of wheels, could use a little bit more. I'll bring that out. That's pretty good. There it is. Now we have a little bit of preload on there and a little bit of preload on the back one. And we are set. That's not going anywhere. You can kind of feel it tenses up when you get this backside on here. So there's some preload on here, as you can see. It doesn't fall by itself, but it does roll smooth. And this is what you want to make sure you fine tune, dial it in, because this is what determines how precise the machine is actually going to be when it's cutting. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. This is a great time to bring in some silicone and just spray it on a rag or something and just wipe it in the rails. This will help make sure everything runs smooth, and wipe it on the wheels. So everything is tightened down. We have our preload added. That's nice. That looks good. No movement. Remember, only use silicone. All right, let's move on to the next step. All right, for this step, you're going to want to locate your anti-backlash nut block kit, which comes with 2 M5 lock nuts, a low profile nut, as well as a set screw, rub screw. We also need to locate 2 20mm low profile screws and 3mm aluminum spacers, 2 of those. So what we're going to do is add the anti-backlash nut block to our plate. And I just want you to take note of the plate, how it has the eccentric side here. So let's flip it over like this and just copy what I'm doing here. Take your 20mm screws and put them at the bottom like you see here. And the eccentrics are on this side, the bigger side. Hold your fingers on here, flip this over, put our 3mm spacers on. Just going to set that down for a minute while we prepare our nut block. So take our set screw and screw that in place. And just like before, we'll bring it in until it just kisses the this face here. You may not need to make any adjustments on it. There it is. Go ahead and lock it on with the low profile M5 nut, like that. And we're going to insert our M5 lock nuts here. So this is the finalized design. And we're going to spin this around just like you see it here and place it on like this. This will leave us plenty of room for adjustments later, whatever we have to do. Let's go ahead and flip that over and we'll tighten this in place. So you can see I'm tightening this down, and just like before, we're going to back this out a couple turns. I like to put the plate down like this because you know you're going to get a pretty square. If I put my thumb here pressing down, you know you're going to get a pretty square nut block doing it this way. So now I'm just snugging it. It's not overly tightened, but it is locked in place. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, for this step, let's go ahead and bring in our lead screw, the last of the lead screws, and we'll just go ahead and put that through. Just make sure that it goes through nice and easy. I'm going to go ahead and go halfway with it. I don't think you're going to need to worry about any movement there, but that looks good. Tighten this down just a notch. There you go. That's nice. Okay, so let's bring the C-beam back in. Put Put that in place. Get that centered. And that looks great. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so locate your OpenBuilds router / spindle mount, and it just sits on like this, and it comes with two 20mm screws that screw in here and here. Let's go ahead and put that on real quick to hold it in place. That looks good. Alright, let's move on to the next step. Alright, for this step, let's go ahead and separate the gantry, the Z gantry from the C-beam. And what you want to do is you want to take your Z gantry plate, looking at it like this. You'll notice if I take my router mount, looking on the back, we have 4 tapped holes back here. We're going to line those up with these 2 outside holes here. And again, just take notice that the eccentrics are to your right on the side here. And it's just going to sit just like you see here. Alright, so let's go ahead and locate 2 10mm screws. And we're going to go ahead and screw that on through the back here on the last set of holes. Go ahead and get the smaller Allen. I'm going to tweak this just to make sure these screws are really on there. That looks good. Nice. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so for this step you're going to want to locate 2 of your cast corners as well as 4 10mm screws. And we're going to be mounting these cast corners to the threaded holes of both the plate as well as the router mount. One here and one on the far side here. So let's go ahead and do that now. You can drop the screws in. So you're going to want to back these screws off a little bit so this is loose. Until we're able to mount these bottom ones, which we're going to do now. There you go, it's nice and flush. We'll mount this one. That looks good. So these screws here are mounted nice and tight on the bottom, and now we're going to go back and tighten these in place. And that will give us a lot of strength along this plate. So that looks good. Let's go ahead and put it back into our C-beam. There we go. Nice, it's coming together as a Z-axis. It's looking good. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, you're going to want to locate 2 of your 8mm lock collars and the set screws. Let's go ahead and put the set screws in the lock collar. Looks good. Alright, so locate 2 8mm shims as well as the 2 8mm bearings. Let's slide our lock collars on first, onto each end. And then we'll put our shims on next. Remember, if you feel it, it has that punch rounded side. You want the rounded side facing out this way towards the bearings. That will go on next. So the rounded side on this one's facing out. Here comes the bearing. Here comes this bearing. And that is how you want that assembly to look. Looks good. Let's move on. Okay, so for this step we are going to be adding the T-nuts that are going to be needed for attaching the frame to the Z-axis as well as the handle to the Z-axis. So your best bet is to get your T-nuts out and lay them out just like I'm showing you here. Also lay out your Z-axis just like we have it here. Remember, these are loose so they could come off. Just leave them like that. And we're going to turn the Z-axis on its side and we're going to insert these T-nuts where they go. So I got one here, one here. I'm just going to lay it out exactly like it should be. I have 3 going down this end. And then you can just copy. Just so you can kind of get an idea is that there's going to be a plate here with 2 holes in it that connects here. This is going to be where a handle goes on the side here. And then this is a plate that has 3 holes in it that connects to part of the frame as well. So this is what you need. You might need to pause the video, but just go ahead and set up the T-nuts just like you see here. Alright, so let's go ahead. I've laid out the T-nuts again, and we're going to mirror this on the opposite side. So very carefully, just rotating this over because there are loose parts in there. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and mirror the same thing. I'll show you once we're done what it should look like. So again, take a look here. Just copy the same thing that we have here. Again, this is going to be for the plate that attaches to the frame. This is for the handle. And this is for another plate that attaches to the frame. Okay, that looks good. Once you have that done, let's move on to the next step. For this step, you're going to want to grab 2 more T-nuts. And if you flip the actuator on its back, you're going to need a T-nut here and a T-nut here. So go ahead and just do that now. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, just rotate your Z-axis back over. Straighten out anything that may need straightening. That looks good. You're going to want to locate 2 of your C-beam end mounts. And they have the bearing recess hole on this side, as you can see. And bearing recess hole on this side. You can see the hole pattern that's going to match the end pattern here. Go ahead and just set that in place on each side. Looks like that. And you're going to want to locate 8 of your 15mm screws. And let's go around here and just screw these on. Remember, we screw these in and then we back them off just a half turn or so. Let's do that now. So I have this side screwed on. I'm just backing these out just a hair. This will allow me to have a little bit of movement. Very little right there. That looks good. Let's carefully turn this. And you don't have to worry about where these T-nuts fall. They'll be fine. Let's go ahead and put these screws in. This will lock everything in place. Okay, again, got a loose fit on there. That looks good. Let's go ahead and push, since this is the bottom, let's go ahead and push our lead screw all the way flush here, like you see on the bottom. And bring our lock collar bearing assembly and seat it into the recess area here. And let's tighten that in place. Looks good. I'm going to screw this down a little bit so it's out of my way. Okay. I'll go ahead and seat this side. Now you can see how this whole assembly can easily move out of there if you're not careful. So make sure you push it in. And I like to put my thumb on here, push down, and push this in with 2 fingers so it's holding tight, and then tighten this set screw down. And it's super important to get this right because this just determines that there's no play this way, and you want to make sure that there isn't any. Once you have that done, go ahead and finish tightening down that little half turn that you left these open. These screws over here and on the back side here. That'll ensure a nice tight fit. You should be able to turn this and move it back and forth. If you have to add a little silicone, go ahead. You can spray it right down in here and you can see the lead screw is down in there. That'll hit the lead screw. Get some of that silicone onto the anti-backlash nut block. Give you nice smooth rotations. You can also spray here in where these meet and get a little lubrication there as well as here. Alright, so that's a great looking Z-axis so far. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, you're going to want to locate your 1/4x8mm flexible coupling. Let's go ahead and turn this around. And you're just going to want to slide this on here, but leave yourself a millimeter gap between, just a little bit between here, so that it doesn't rub on the plate. So let's go ahead and tighten that down now. One thing I will mention is you have to make sure you close this gap so you have a nice tight fit onto your 8mm lead. Once you have that in place, rotate the flexible coupling over and tighten down the small set screw. Make sure it's in place. You should be able to turn this freely and get an idea of how your Z-axis feels. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, you're going to want to locate your NEMA 23 stepper motor, as well as 2 55mm low profile screws and 2 40mm aluminum spacers. And we are going to mount the motor onto the end of our Z-axis. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take your stepper motor and find the flat part of the shaft You can see it here. And I'm going to face it up this way away from the wires, which are towards the bottom. Go ahead and line this up. We want to turn our flexible coupling until the small set screw is facing up. Flat part of the shaft is facing up. Let's go ahead and take our 40mm spacers and put them in between. You might have to pull your motor out a little bit. Take our 55mm screws and slide them through the spacer and screw them into the C-beam end mount threaded part of the block. They get tight towards the end. We'll come back and get that in a minute. Go ahead and do the other side as well. Once they start getting tight, go ahead and flip the whole assembly over and try to get it from this side. Be careful not to strip it out using the ball end. If you have to, go back to the smaller Allen key. Just take your time. Okay, that's in there nice and tight. Let's go ahead and line up the set screw in the flat part of the shaft and tighten that down in position. Wiggle it back and forth and make sure it found that flat part. That's good. Let's rotate this over and let's tighten down the clamp portion now. Alright, it's nice and tight. If you can't rotate this, it may mean that your stepper motor wires are touching, so just make sure you untouch them so that the coils aren't shorting out. And this is what you're after for your Z-axis. That looks really good. Let's move on to the next step. One last step is we need to go through and just jog this Z-axis down, manually move it down to the end here. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten down our anti-backlash nut block. Just snug it into place. Do not over tighten it because it will deform the plastic. Let's jog this back up and everything should feel tight, should feel good. That looks really good. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so on this next set of steps, what we're going to be doing is taking our X and Y and Z assembly and connecting them all together by building this frame that's made up of a couple C-beams. So we're basically going to be attaching these plates to create that system of connection. There are also plates on top here as well that need connecting. So just follow along with the video. We'll get the whole thing assembled and ready to go. So go ahead and bring your Z-axis assembly back in. And you're also going to want 2 of your 3-hole connect joining plates and 4 of your 10mm screws. Let's go ahead and rotate this over. And right now we have all the T-nuts here. Just go ahead and push these out of the way so you only have 2 here on the bottom. And we're going to take our 3-hole joining plate, connect it just like this, and put 2 of our 10mm screws in here. Let's go ahead and do that now. And I'm leaving them a little bit loose. I just want to line this up with the face here and even across the bottom here. Now I can tighten it down. That looks good. Let's rotate the whole assembly over. Do the same thing on this side. Okay, that looks good. This is what you should have up to this point. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, for this step you're going to want to locate 2 of your 90-degree joining plates and 6 of your 10mm screws. And just lay your Z-axis out the same way you see here. Let me go ahead and separate these a little bit. So we're going to be mounting this, if you look here, just like this. And this is a temporary location. We'll move it into position later. So just kind of line up the holes the best that you can. And slide these screws in place. If you need to, use your driver to line the screws. I just tighten the first one down and then move on to the second one, align the second one, get that in place. And I'm not tightening them all the way down, obviously, so I can move them, and then I can line up the last one. Alright, that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and just move this down here somewhere and just tighten down the middle screw for now. Let's do the same thing on the other side. Going to go just like this. So I'll start with the first one, lining it up. So again, I can move this. I'm just going to put it right here, tighten down the center. We'll move that later. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. For this step, we're going to be adding the handles. So let's go ahead and locate both handles and 4 of the 10mm screws. And we're going to go ahead and put them right here. I'm going to separate these a little bit. Have the screw in there. Just gonna get that lined up with the T-nut and keeping it loose. Line it up with the second T-nut. Now on these handles, let's go ahead and push them all the way down to the bottom here, like this. And then we'll tighten them in place. All right, that's nice. That's what you're looking for right here. Let's go ahead and do the other side. Go ahead and line this one up. And again, just push it down to the bottom and tighten it down. That's looking really good. Let's move on to the next step. On this step, you're going to want to locate 2 of your cast corners as well as 2 8mm screws. And we're going to be screwing them into these T-nuts. So I'm going to go ahead and slide these forward like this. Go ahead and take your cast corner, insert one of your screws there, and just go ahead and put that in place for now. Let's just scoot them up out of the way a little bit. I'm not tightening them down, just getting them kind of in place. Let's go ahead and do this one. And you can see how easy it is to just adjust these and move them wherever we want along this track. So let's just get them out of our way for now, and that looks good. So that's what you're after so far. Very nice. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, you're going to want to locate the small piece of C-beam that you have, as well as 2 10mm screws and 2 T-nuts. Go ahead and flip the Z-axis assembly over, and we're going to be attaching the small piece of C-beam like you see here. Just lining this edge up here with this edge here. This is the look that you're after. Get that in position like you see it here. And what we're going to do, I'm going to lay this on its side because we need to thread one of the T-nuts underneath of here. Just kind of push it in a little bit until you're lined up with that hole. Go ahead and put your 10mm screw in. Tighten that in position. Okay, that looks good there. Let's flip this over to the other one as well. The other side. Make sure you're pushed in tight here. Squeeze this assembly together if you have to. Thread this in. That looks good. Everything's nice and tight there. Alright, let's move on to the next step. Alright, so on this step we're going to be adding the screws for this plate here. So we're going to go ahead and get 4 more of your T-nuts, also 4 more of your 10mm screws. And go ahead and just thread these in. If I can get a view of this. Thread these T-nuts in place here and move your plate over top. And get them started. Get a few of the threads started here. And then this whole plate should slide down like this towards the bottom. And just tighten down one screw here to keep it from moving. That looks good. Let's do the same thing on the opposite side. Let's go ahead and move this plate down. Tighten one just to hold it in place. That looks really good. Let's go ahead and spin this around. Take these corners and just bring them down, loosen them up and bring them down here to the bottom. So let's go ahead and stand this up on end. Might make it a little bit easier. And just line these cast corners up the best that you can with this bottom hole and tighten these in place. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. For this next step, we're going to be using 2 self-tapping screws to screw down these cast corners onto this piece of C-beam. Now you could go ahead and tap this if you wanted to and screw them down, but I just find it's easy just to go ahead and just use a drill and just screw these in place. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Little tip with these self-tapping screws, it may be easier for you if you run them back and forth. Make sure your drill is on low. And just run them back and forth a little bit to get them started as they dig in. And once they're there, they're there. Go ahead and screw those in. Doesn't matter if the holes are already tapped or not, just screws right into the aluminum. So that's good. Let's move on to the next step. So for this step, let's go ahead and lay this down and we'll loosen up our plate here. And what you're going to do is just go up to here until this edge here is even with the back of the plate, like you can see just here. Just bring it up like that and go ahead and just tighten that in position. This will really strengthen up this whole plate C-beam assembly. Give it a nice rigid connection. And just go around and alternate your screws until you know you got a nice solid connection. So that is what you're after right there. That looks good. Let's go ahead and do this side. Again, I'm looking here just to make sure I'm even. Tighten that down. Alright, that looks great. Kind of get an idea of how solid this is coming together to be. It looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, so for this step we're going to move this Z-axis assembly to the side for now, and we want to bring in a piece of 250 C-beam like you see here. And you see how I have it setting down like this? Go ahead and copy that. Bring in 2 of your 3-hole joining plates as well as 4 of your self-tapping screws. And you're going to need your drill because the plan here is to screw these in like you see here. So we'll be doing 1, 2, 3, 4 screw taps there. So go ahead and do that now. Again, you can go forward and back if need be to get these to go in. Make sure your drill's on low. So that's just what you're after here. Simple as just getting those screwed in place, and they hold really well. So let's go ahead and do this side now. Okay, that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step we're going to be connecting these 90-degree joining plates. So you're going to need 8 of your 10mm screws and 8 of your T-nuts and 2 of the 90-degree joining plates. So just pay attention to the way that these are facing. So you want to set up your plate like this. And what's going to happen is this plate is going to sit just like this on the system on both sides. So let's go ahead and add the T-nuts necessary. So the 4 T-nuts here, so I'm going to do 3 on this side to correspond to these 3 holes. And then we need 1 here for this hole. So that's good there. Let's go ahead and put the screws in and get this plate started. Again, just leave them loose and it makes it easy so you can move them around and line up the holes. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and just move this out of the way for now. And I'm just going to tighten that 1 screw down. Flip this unit over and like this. We'll do the same thing on this side, just mirror the whole assembly. So again, we need 3 of the T-nuts and 1 on this side. And we'll go ahead and put these in place. Alright, that looks good. I'm going to move this down here, just random, and just tighten down that screw. Keep it in place. And that's what you're after right there. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, on this step we're going to be adding these cast corners on the end, like you see here. So you'll need 2 8mm screws and 2 T-nuts. Let's go ahead and put our T-nuts in place. Put these over top. Alright, these are loose. I'm just going to leave them like about 1 inch from the edge, and I'm pushing them in a little bit. We'll come back and get these later. Push this one over this way, like that. Alright, looking good. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so we're going to be adding 2 more of the 90-degree joining plates for this step. Go ahead and just follow along what we're doing here. The plan is to add these like this, where they hang over the edge, because another plate will be connecting here. So you're going to need 2 of the joining plates, 4 of your 10mm screws, and 4 of your T-nuts. Let's go ahead and add the T-nuts to this back track here. We need 2 of them. Go ahead and do this. Add our 10mm screws. Go ahead and see where that is. Line it up. Okay, that looks good. And you'll notice that I have this hanging over the edge, and that's totally fine. Just tighten one of those down to get it in place. We're going to do the same thing on this side. It's going to sit just like this. So go ahead and add 2 of the T-nuts. Nice. These don't have to be even or anything at this point. Just getting them in position. And this is what the frame assembly should look like so far. Looks great. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, we're going to be adding 2 more cast corners. So you want to locate 2 cast corners, 2 T-nuts, 2 more 8mm low profile screws. For the frame assembly, one of the things we need to do is loosen these cast corners that we have here, rotate them 180 degrees, and move them up out of the way, like you see here. Get them up out like this, and that is what you're looking for here. Let's go ahead and add our T-nuts for the new cast corners. I'm going to bring them up a little bit, and this is what they're going to look like when they're on. Just like that. This is the assembly you're after, so go ahead and add these cast corners now. So like you see here, I'm going to move these down a little bit. Move these down a little. Okay, that looks good. Copy this assembly just like you see it here. It's looking good so far. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so for this step, I brought back the Z-axis assembly as well as our frame assembly. And what we're going to be doing is connecting the two together. You can see here, if you slide them together, this is what you're after. You can see that this plate lines up to the top here. So we're going to get 2 of our self-tapping screws and screw this plate into place. I'm going to go ahead and just screw this into place. You can see I have it kind of sitting at an angle like this, and it's kind of holding its own weight. Let's go ahead and get those in position. Got a good connection here. Lay this on its side. Okay, let's move on to the next step. So for this step, we're going to be attaching this 90-degree corner connecting plate to the short piece of C-beam here. So you're going to need 2 T-nuts as well as 2 10mm screws. Go ahead and take one of the T-nuts and slide it into the track here, and just use the driver to align it with the hole. Go ahead and put the 10mm screw in place. So I have it loose right now. I'm going to go ahead and squeeze this assembly. You can see it coming together here. Squeeze it together and go ahead. That's good for this side. Let's go ahead and flip it over and do the opposite side. So again, we got our T-nut here, sliding in here, lining up with the plate hole. 10mm screws going in place. Got to tighten that down, keeping it loose. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. All right, so at this point, let's go ahead and loosen these 3 screws here. We want this to just be loose so this plate can move. And we're going to go ahead and bring this plate down, even with it. These plates are even on this edge here. And you'll notice I'm pushing up with my thumb here. I'm just going to tighten this middle screw down. That looks good. Remember, this plate is still loose. We need that to be loose so we can make adjustments here and pull this plate together. Go ahead and tighten down these 2 screws. Just follow along. So we have 1, 2, 3, and now we're going to tighten this 4th one. These 4 are tightened down. This screw is still loose, and these 3 screws are still loose. That's what you want. So let's do it on the opposite side as well. Go ahead and loosen this plate. That's nice and loose. Go ahead and move this plate down till it's even. Again, I'm pushing up with my thumb. Now these can all be adjusted later. Go ahead and tighten these 3 down. Now this 4th one. So again, this screw's loose. These 3 screws are loose as well. So the object is to pull this plate together. You can see I have a bit of a gap there. So I'm going to set this on its back and press down on the top here. Align this plate, and the gap is gone. Go ahead and tighten this down. Tighten down this one, down that one, and that one. So they're all tight on this side now. Let's go ahead and spin it. I'm holding on to the C-beam end mount, just pressing down on it. And again, we're tightening all these down. Just make sure this plate is aligned and it looks nice. Solid assembly there. All right, let's move on to the next step. Okay, on this step, you're going to want to locate 2 more self-tapping screws, and the object here is to bring these corners forward and tap them into this C-beam that you see here. Just make sure that the C-beam is flush. Now that we've pushed it down, it should be okay. Go ahead and loosen up your cast corner, bring it up, align it to the hole under here. Same with this one. Tighten it down, just like that. Go ahead and put these in place. Self-tappers. And we'll go ahead and just tap these in position. If you have to, back out and go back in. And they're a little awkward to get to because of these cast corners here, or keep it at an angle. But just do your best to slowly work it in and you'll get it. Back it out if you have to. Just like that, back and forth until you get it to seat itself. That looks good. Nice job. It's really starting to come together now. It's strong. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and take all the T-nuts that we have here. We're going to move them out about halfway, as well as the ones that are on top. So they're just out of our way. I'll go ahead and do the same here with these 3. So for this step, go ahead and locate 6 of your 10mm screws. The object here is to take our Z-axis frame assembly and attach it, like you see, right on top here. We need to line up the T-nuts with these holes for this plate. So go ahead and lift this up like I'm doing here, and just slide these T-nuts down until they are aligned with the plate, like you see here. Go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side. It'll make it a lot easier when you go to put these on. So we're just lining these up with the holes above. So go ahead and line these holes up, then you can set your plate down. Just make sure that you loosen this so you can get it in the right position. Make sure the holes are lined up. Go ahead and screw those in position. So once you get the first one started, you can go ahead and let go of holding on to it, and also kind of work through here. You may have to loosen this foot in order for the plate to line up properly with the rail. Once you do that, you should be okay. You can tighten it back in position. And go ahead and finish off the rest of the 2 screws that you see here. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and do the other side. I'm going to go ahead and loosen this foot, get it out of the way. Make sure we're lined up. Make sure you're even in the back here. That looks good. Okay, so at this point we're going to lower these corners down. So just going to loosen them up and kind of get them centered with the track there. Tighten them back in position. That looks good. You're going to need 2 of your 8mm screws, and you're going to go ahead and push the T-nuts underneath of the cast corners. Line them up with the hole. Go ahead and put those in place. For this one, you may need your smaller hex driver. Let's do the same thing on this side. Got to start it with that one. I'll use a small hex driver to tighten that down. Go ahead and tighten this down. Alright, that looks good. We are connected. It's a nice and strong connection. On this step, if you feel that the system is rocking, remember we moved these back feet, so go ahead and loosen the front feet until you get a nice solid grounding. These feet aren't really necessary, but what's nice about them is you could actually add rubber feet on this machine. It'd be really nice. Alright, on this step we're going to do a little bit of cable management. So go ahead and grab 2 of the zip ties, put those on. Make sure you leave it so you can cut the excess off. So what you're after is something like this. Go ahead and take a pair of snips and snip off the excess. That looks good. So let's go ahead and do the next axis, and you need 2 more of your zip ties. Bring us around to the back here, and we're just going to zip tie it to this side here. Go ahead and do that now. There's the other. Let's go ahead and snip those off. That looks good. Go ahead and do the Z now. We'll lay the whole system on its side like this and we'll zip it right to here. So you need 2 more zip ties. Alright, that looks good. Snip these off. Looks nice. This next step, we're going to be attaching brackets. These single L brackets that you see here. These will allow us to attach a power supply to the back of the MiniMill. You can see I have a 24-volt power supply and it just screws into one side here and it holds nice and sturdy. That makes a nice connection. So we'll go ahead and add those brackets now. Okay, so for this step, you're going to want to locate 2 8mm screws, 2 of your single corner brackets, as well as 2 drop-in T-nuts. And one of the things you want to notice about the single corner brackets is you'll notice one hole is inset further and one hole is out to the outside edge. This is the hole that will be facing the power supply, and this is the hole that we'll be using to mount into the track. So taking one of your screws, go ahead and put it in like this. Put your drop-in T-nut on just like you see here, with the grid with the teeth facing in, and you simply line it up with your track. On this one, we're going to go right into this track here on the back, turn it like this, and then you tighten it in place and the lock and the drop-in T-nut will grab the inside edge of the track like that. Just make it flush with this outside edge and bring it up to the top. So this is what you're after. That looks good. Go ahead and do the next one. The next one will actually be down here, so should be a little easier. Just remember, the hole that's facing out the furthest is the power supply side, and this is a track mount side. And as you're doing it, just make sure you see it turn into the track there. Just make sure you're flush with the backside edge here. And on this one, I'm about 1 inch away from the bottom. That'll get us close. So something like that, and that one's like that. So that's what you're after. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and mount the power supply. You'll notice that these power supplies have M3 holes here on the back, and that is what we're going to be attaching to our corner brackets that we just put on here. So it'll sit on basically just like that. And we'll screw it in from the front. You're going to need 2 of your 6mm M3s and 2 of the shims. Let me go ahead and turn this around. But I want you to take note, as this becomes a great wire track to run your wires through as you feed the circuit. Let's go ahead and turn this around. We're going to mount here and here using these M3 screws. So I'm going to go ahead and get one of the M3 screws ready. Go ahead and put the shim on there. See here? I'm going to go ahead and put the nut driver on so I can be ready for it. Alright, so I'm set up here ready to go. And I'm going to go ahead and put my power supply on. I have the bottom side facing down. Just going to line it up with the screw hole. Like that. Looks good there. And I'll line up the top one up here and do the same thing. I had to put the driver through the handle here to get a good grip, but I got it now. Alright, so our power supply is on. That looks nice. Alright guys, so here's the complete MiniMill assembled. Basically waiting to add electronics to it. Looks really nice. I've got both MiniMills here. One of them is mechanical version here that we just finished building, and this one has the wiring and everything complete on this unit. It's actually a running unit. Just wanted to show you, I use a DeWalt 611 on this, and I just put some heavy duty tape around here a few times to build it out so that this router mount will hold on to it. I wanted to show you some of the wiring. I'm not the best at wiring, but you can see here we ran like we did on the mechanical. We zipped this and I just ran it underneath here and have it go up underneath into the circuit board up here. I'm running this off of an X Pro. Just have everything wired here, zip tied together, and just came out really good looking. My power cord goes down underneath. The power supply comes out right here at the bottom, and pretty much it. My mains are right here coming out, so everything gets zip tied together Basically what you're left with is your USB plug for the spindle and plug for the power supply, and you're good to go. So just wanted to give you a little bit of that as an overview. I know everybody does their wiring differently depending on what board you're using, but just wanted to give you a heads up on the way we did ours here. Hope that helps. So we're really excited to have the OpenBuilds MiniMill in the workshop, and we're excited to see what you guys can create with it. All the best with your build, have fun, and be sure to post your projects on openbuilds.com.